Okay, I told you that we are going to try to finish up the book of Revelation in 2 lessons. So today, I'm hoping that we'll be able to finish the third vision, and then next week, we'll be able to finish up the fourth vision. The fourth vision is not a very long vision, but we're going to be picking up where we left off last week. So if you want to turn in your Bibles to chapter 20, verse 7. One of the things I told you at the end of the lesson last week is this is a real point. It's a real transition point. It's an inflection point within the book of Revelation. I told you the very first week that I take a modified preterist view of the book of Revelation. I do believe that most of the predictive prophecies found in the book of Revelation have already occurred. They probably occurred within the couple of generations of the original audience. However, there are parts of the book of Revelation that have not yet been fulfilled. And at this point right now, where we are starting, Revelation chapter 20, verse 7, we're getting into predictive prophecies that have not yet been fulfilled. So these are still in the future. Could be in the near future, could be in the distant future, we don't know. But I want you to understand there's a distinction in the book. What we've already read has happened. What we're getting ready to study has not yet happened. So there is a distinction that we need to make in the book. So we are in the third vision right now. We have seen the image of the doom of Babylon, and the principal characters that John was able to see was a great prostitute, which represented Babylon the Great, which was their code name for Rome, the city of Rome. And she was sitting or riding on top of a scarlet beast, which represented the nations that had been controlled by Rome. We also were allowed to see the wedding of the Lamb, and we understand in the book of Revelation when the name Lamb is used, it's talking about Christ. And so in this case, the wedding of the Lamb is between the groom, Christ, and his bride, the church. And last week, we discussed what we refer to as the Battle of Armageddon. And we're going to pick up right at the end of Battle of Armageddon. Now, the Battle of Armageddon, that terminology is not actually used in the book of Revelation, but it has become a common phrase used to describe that portion of the book. So this week we will be discussing the overthrow of Satan, and we will be discussing the judgment at the great white throne. So just a bit of a review right now. Last week we saw the final image of Christ presented in chapter 19. He's riding a white horse, and he has all of the trappings which describe for us without a doubt that this is Christ leading his army. They're also on white horses. You can see them riding in behind him, and they are entering this great battle between good and evil. And the result of the battle is recorded for us in verse 20 of chapter 19, that the beast from the sea as well as the beast from the earth, which is the false prophet, these two were thrown into the lake of fire. And they will be receiving torment day and night forever and ever. We will never see these two allies of Satan again. And towards the end of this description of the Battle of Armageddon, we saw an angel appear from heaven. He had with him a key that represented supreme authority, and it was a key over the abyss, and he was also carrying a chain that he used to bind Satan. And the text tells us that he bound Satan for 1,000 years. I described for you what the 1,000-year reference was talking about. We'll discuss that again today. But at this point in time, this is where we left Satan. He's bound. He's not been banished completely, but he is bound for a very long period of time, and he's not quite as dangerous as he was during those first few centuries of the early church. And that brings us up to verse 7 in chapter 20, where we're going to start our class today. Verse 7 says, "When the 1,000 years were completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad side of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them." And verse 10 is very important. It says, "And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophets are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." So here we see the final and ultimate demise of Satan. I remind you, this hasn't occurred yet, but we're seeing into the future that Satan will be totally defeated, and he will also be cast into this lake of fire. And I've got to tell you that these first 10 verses of chapter 20, we read some of them last week and we finished them up today, have mystified people for generations. They have caused all kinds of wild speculations, and they've been the basis of so many false doctrines. So we really need to approach this section of Revelation very carefully. But these verses have been used to describe what people might call the 1,000-year reign of Christ or the millennium, but I'm telling you, that's not the focus of this passage. It's not anything like that. It's talking about Christ's ultimate victory over Satan. That is the main point of this passage, the overthrow of Satan, not a 1,000-year reign of Christ, not a reign on earth. It's not even a literal 1,000 years. And what I mentioned last week is, like almost every other number used in the book of Revelation, this is not a literal number. It is a symbolic number. And it simply represents an extended period of time, a very long period of time, as opposed to a short period of time. And it can best be described as this period of peace that we're living in right now, where Satan is bound. The persecution has ended, and we're in this period of peace. Now, we do have a date for when persecution ended, and that would be 326 AD during the reign of Emperor Constantine. He issued an Edict of Milan, commonly known as the Edict of Toleration, which brought an official end to the Roman persecution of Christians. So we basically know when this 1,000 years started. It was around 326 AD, and it is still continuing today. So from that, we can tell it was not a literal 1,000 years. But this extended period of peace, symbolically referred to as 1,000 years, started about that time and is going on today. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time. Let's take a closer look at what the text actually says about this extended period of peace during which Satan was restrained. The first thing that we can say that we saw in verse 2 last week was that the angel took hold of Satan and bound him for 1,000 years. In verse 3, we saw that the angel threw Satan into the abyss, where he will remain until the 1,000 years were completed. So there will be an end to this 1,000-year period of time. The text tells us that in verse 3. And then in verse 4, it tells us that the souls of the martyrs, remember the scene? John saw the souls of the martyrs seated on thrones, and they were reigning with Christ for 1,000 years, according to verse 4. We saw that last week. So my comment about that was promises were made to these martyrs in the chapters 2 and 3, and promises were kept, and we saw that here last week. But we do know that Christ's reign is not going to be limited in any way. It's not going to be limited to 1,000 years or in any way, because we learned in chapter 11, verse 15, that the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he, Christ, will reign forever and ever. And I don't know about you, but when I read forever and ever, that has no ending whatsoever. There is no limit being placed, no time limit whatsoever on the reign of Christ, 1,000 years or otherwise. And Revelation is very clear that Christ will reign forever. So I do not think that what we're reading in this passage about the 1,000 years should be held in conflict with what we already know about the reign of Christ being forever. But what does the text tell us about what's going to happen at the end, at the conclusion of this 1,000 years, as it's referring to? Verse 7 that we just read tells us that Satan will be released from his imprisonment in the abyss. And going back last week to verse 3, Satan will only be released for a short time. He won't have a long period of time that he's going to be released onto the earth. We also know in verse 8 that we just read that Satan will come out to deceive the nations all across the earth. What did it say? The four corners of the earth. In other words, Satan will have an opportunity to launch his persecution against the church one last time, but it will not last very long. And it's interesting to me that Satan's methods have not changed any in all of this period of time that he's been bound. His main weapon is still deception through the use of surrogates and allies. And the text in verse 8 introduces us to some of his new allies when he comes out. Satan will have Gog and Magog in verse 8. Now, if Gog and Magog sound familiar to you, they should, because they were also described for us in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, where they symbolize the ultimate enemies of God. And they're still representing the ultimate enemies of God, even in this passage. But here I would describe them more as representing the nations in rebellion against God at this final stage of the earth. Satan's new allies, according to verse 8, will gather the nations for the war, and their goal is the total annihilation of God's people, but God intervenes. Notice that in verse 9. Gog and Magog will briefly, let me get you a picture up here. Gog and Magog will briefly revive Satan's persecution for one last skirmish before they are devoured by fire from heaven, according to verse 9. But if you read that passage carefully, and we just read it, there's no mention of any harm coming to God's people during this final skirmish. Now, I don't know if there will be harm, but there's nothing mentioned in the text. The way that John describes this part of the vision, it sounds like the evil forces were ready to strike, but God strikes first. Let me read that verse to you again. Verse 9 says that these forces came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. It was a pretty decisive victory for Christ, or will be in the future. And then the most important part of this passage, in my opinion, is what happened to Satan. And we pick up that part of the story in verse 10. Satan will be thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. And this is the same lake of fire and brimstone where in chapter 19 the beast from the earth and the beast from the sea were thrown. Satan, the dragon, will be no more. His allies will be no more. And Satan's campaign against Christians will be completely over. There'll be no return, no further rebellion. It has been foretold, and it will happen. Now John's going to direct our attention towards something very different. The judgment, the final judgment at the great white throne of God. And this part of the vision picks up in verse 11. John writes, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, and from whose presence earth and heaven fled, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds." So the vision shifts from Satan's destruction to human accountability. Both are extremely important concepts for us to understand that are going to occur at the end of time. But all humans will be accountable before God. This scene portrays the final judgment. It is a universal, impartial, and inescapable event. The great white throne symbolizes absolute authority and final judgment. The color white, we've talked in class before, this represents purity. It represents righteousness and holiness. And the one seated on the throne, make no mistake about it, it's very clear here, this is God himself seated on the throne. Though all of the main enemies of Christ have been destroyed, God's judgment is not complete. It still remains for those human followers of Satan, as well as the human followers of wicked governments and false prophets, must also face God's judgment and God's justice, according to verse 12. And I believe that these human followers of Satan include the unbelievers, but they also include those who were once faithful but have fallen away and now have become unfaithful to God. And the judgment scene continues with verse 13, gives us some more description. It says, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to their deeds." Verse 14 is very interesting. "Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire." This is the second death, the lake of fire. "If anyone's name is not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." It will happen, according to John. So verses 13 through 15 concludes this part of the vision, this final judgment at the great white throne. And I think this is probably the most frightening scene in the entire book of Revelation, certainly the most awe-inspiring scene that we have, because this is describing the final judgment at the end of time. Every person, no matter where or how they died, will be resurrected and judged, according to verse 13. Death and Hades themselves will be destroyed. They will no longer have any purpose after the final judgment, according to verse 14. And also in verse 14, it tells us again that this lake of fire, this is the second death. We talked about this last week. The first death is the death that we are familiar with. It is the end of our life on earth. It's a separation from life on earth, physical death. The second death is spiritual death. It's a separation from God, and it will occur for those whose names are not recorded in the Lamb's Book of Life. The earth and heaven fled away, verse 11, and they ceased to exist. Now, there are a few things that we should learn from the book of Revelation about this final judgment, and I'm going to go through some of those with you here in just here. It'll take a few moments. But the first thing that we need to understand about this final judgment is that it is inescapable. No one is going to avoid or escape the judgment. There will be no exceptions. What did verse 12 tell us? John saw the dead, the great, and the small standing before the throne. That includes everyone. And I think the dead here refers to all who have died prior to the second coming of Christ. But I also believe that this is going to include all of those that are living at the time of Christ's return. We will all be judged. Everyone will be included. Verse 13 says that the sea even gave up the dead who were in it. So those whose bodies and final resting places have been hopelessly lost, thought we would never find them again, they will be included in the judgment. You will be there. I will be there. We will all stand before the throne of God. Billions upon billions of people will be there for the final judgment. From every land, every civilization, both known and forgotten, they will all be at the final judgment. No one will be overlooked. All who have been buried at sea or buried in the ground or in mausoleums, all who have been cremated or frozen or shot into space, it makes no difference. Everyone will be at the final judgment. It is inescapable, and we will all be held accountable. So that's the first thing we can learn about the final judgment. It is inescapable. The second thing that we can learn is that it is factual. It is going to be by the book, the way that it's described here. Verse 12 tells us that books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. So it even identifies one of the books. It's the book of life. And these books that were opened may very well contain all of the covenants that God has made with mankind down through the ages. Let me give you some examples. We know that there was a patriarchal age in the Old Testament, and there weren't many written regulations during the patriarchal age, but God governed these people, and they knew it. God sent his prophets, and they were inspired teachers that told them the will of God. And then there was the law of Moses that was given on Mount Sinai to the Israelites. And those people will be judged according to the laws that they were under, either the patriarchal law or the Mosaic law. But we are not going to be judged according to the patriarchal law or the Mosaic law because we have a different law. We have the gospel of Christ. We will be judged according to the gospel of Christ. Verse 12 also says that another book was opened, and it identifies it as the book of life. We've read a lot about the book of life in passages as we've been studying here in the book of Revelation. And I think this is simply a ledger, a written ledger of all who are saved. And this book, it should be of particular importance to us because what does it say here in verse 15 that we just read? That anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire. So we want our names to be recorded in the book of life, obviously. We've learned in several places in Revelation, particularly back in chapter 3, verse 5, that this book of life is kept up to date. So it's possible for our names to be written in the book of life only to have it erased because of our rebellious, sinful behavior, our actions. Now, the third thing that we should point out, the judgment is inescapable, it is factual, and it is final. Verse 14 and 15 is very chilling when it tells us that death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. And this, as we know, is where Satan was cast and all of his allies in earlier chapters. There's no coming back from the lake of fire. It is final. Now we learn that anyone whose name is not found in this book of life will also meet that same fate. They'll be cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, according to the text. It is and this sentence is final. There's no chance of appeal. There's no 12th hour stay. There's no exoneration. It is final. Our fate is basically sealed with our first death. And the second death to come upon the wicked will be the final, and it will be final and eternal. And one thing that we need to understand about this, in this circumstance, It is not God that is condemning us. We condemn ourselves. The wicked and disobedient condemn themselves to the lake of fire because of their sins. If we are lost, we have no one else to blame other than ourselves, because God has given us everything that we need to know to ensure that our names are written in the Lamb's book of life. It's up to us to heed the warnings and to follow his instruction. Now, one more thing that I've just added this last week that we can really understand. To clarify, this is not a trial like we're familiar with court cases and trials. I just want to point out here that we will not have a lawyer pleading our case at the final judgment. We will not be allowed to present any legal arguments, because by the time of the judgment, we have already been tried. God already knows our deeds. There will be no cross-examination of witnesses, no presentation of evidence, no legal loopholes to try to jump through. Judgment at the great white throne is not a trial, it is a sentencing. So we need to think about it in those terms. It is a sentencing rather than a trial. So at this point in the vision, those whose names were not found in the Lamb's book of life have now been cast into the lake of fire. And tragically, John had to witness this eternal destination for these evildoers. And don't you know that this part of the vision was just heartbreaking for the Apostle John to witness? When we were studying chapter 10, I told you that I believe when John was instructed to eat this small scroll that was sweet on his lips and bitter in his stomach, I believe that was a preparation for the difficult prophecies that he was going to see and have to explain later on in the book of Revelation. I think this is one of those prophecies that he was being prepared for back in chapter 10. I know it had to be difficult for John. But in the next chapter, it's going to get better. It's going to improve, I promise you. John will be shown something much more joyous. He will be shown the eternal destination for the faithful, those whose names are written in the book of life. They're going to have a very different outcome. And so the remainder of the book of Revelation is focused on the splendor of heaven. There are not going to be any more frightening battles or wars or dragons or beasts or any of that. That's all done at this point in time. We don't have to worry about those. It's only going to be talking about the beauty of heaven. And there's nothing but beauty in heaven. There's absolutely nothing to fear in heaven. So as we start chapter 21, let's keep that in mind. New Jerusalem, the new heaven, the new earth. Verse 1, John says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth passed away, and there's no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the tabernacle of God is among the people, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death, there will no longer be any mourning, or crying, or pain. The first things have passed away.'" So we're getting a glorious, glorious introduction here of this New Jerusalem, as John is describing it in his symbolic language. These verses describe the eternal hope of believers, both believers in the first century and believers today. We are all hoping for the same thing, and that is a restored creation, but more importantly, a restored relationship with our God. And heaven is where this will be achieved. We will have this restored creation. We will also have this restored relationship with God forever. In the first 4 verses, John sees a holy city, and he calls it New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven for God, in verse 2. And this holy city has been prepared for the bride by the Lamb, and this is tying it back to the description that we had of the wedding of the Lamb at the beginning of chapter 19. And I told you at that time about the traditions around Hebrew weddings, and it was customary for the groom to prepare a home for his bride before the wedding was over. During this interval period, he was preparing a home for his bride before the processional and before the wedding feast. And so we can see that New Jerusalem that we just read about is the home prepared by the groom, by Christ, for his bride, the church. That is what heaven is. It is this home that has been prepared by Christ. And we also know that the bride at this point in time is now adorned for her groom, for Christ. She's been washed clean, pure, and white, and clothed in righteousness. New Jerusalem, as I've already alluded, of course, is heaven. So if you're taking notes, make that note. New Jerusalem is heaven, without a doubt. It's what we describe as heaven. And I believe that John is not just describing a physical place. I think it's much more than that. I want you to indulge me here for just a moment. He's describing a condition for Christians to live, a state of being for our spirit beyond this earthly life. Heaven is a condition of being redeemed of all of our sins. We have sin in our life now, but heaven is a place where we will be redeemed from all sins. We won't have those to worry about, to be embarrassed about, or ashamed of. It is a condition of being free from toil and persecution. We face some persecution today. Certainly the Christians in the first century are facing persecution. They don't have to worry about that. We face labors. We have toils in this life. We won't have any of that to worry about in heaven. It's a different state of mind. It's a different condition. It is also the condition of being in the eternal presence of God, and how wonderful that will be. We can only visualize that and think about that because we've never experienced it yet. But for Christians, for believers, we will experience that after this life. After the second coming. Now, as we've done before, let's talk about what can we learn about heaven from the book of Revelation. This week and next week especially, I'm going to get into several of these points of what we can actually learn about the place that is called New Jerusalem. Heaven is new is the first thing I want to point out to you. John describes seeing what? A new heaven, a new earth. He calls it New Jerusalem. So he's not using this word new lightly. It means something. So the eternal dwelling place of the believers is new. And I want you to know that in the Greek language, there are actually two different words that they used for new. And one of these words is neos, which means made over or renovated. That's not the word John uses here. This is not a renovation of anything that we're familiar with. He uses this other word. It's called kinos, which means new in kind, entirely new, brand new. Nothing old about it whatsoever. So we can understand from what John has written for us that heaven is not a copy of anything that has come before. It is new in kind. It's kinos. And this, there's never been anything that we've ever seen that is like heaven. It is not a renewed version of earth that we may be familiar with. Heaven is an entirely new place, and it is an entirely new realm of existence. The present creation, he talks about heaven and earth, the current heaven and earth have been passed away. The present creation is tainted by sin and decay, and it will be replaced with a renewed order of existence, a new heaven and earth. Heaven is entirely new in every way. It's so new, in fact, that many of the commonplace things that we experience in this life, we will not experience in heaven. What does the text tell us? There'll be no pain, there'll be no sickness, there'll be no death in heaven, no sorrow, no crying. All of these first things, all of these old things have passed away. We won't have to worry about any of these negative things in heaven. Heaven is a place that we want to spend our eternity. And chapter 20 really puts it into perspective for us. New Jerusalem is presented in contrast to the lake of fire that was described in chapter 20. It is the eternal destination of the redeemed versus the eternal destination of the lost. There's no other alternative. Those are the only two alternatives for mankind at the final judgment. You will either go to New Jerusalem or directly into the lake of fire. So I think it's a pretty clear decision where we want to spend our eternity. Now this story that he's telling us about, this vision that he had with New Jerusalem, continues in verse 5. And he says, "He who sat on the throne said, 'Behold, I make all things new.'" That's just what we talked about. Heaven is new. "And he said, 'Write, for these words are faithful and true.' Then he said to me, 'It is done.'" He's talking about this vision, this third vision. "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give water to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost." What a beautiful concept that is. And verse 7, "The one who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." And then on the other hand, in verse 8, he says, but the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and sexually immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So, very clear distinction between the two different outcomes for the believers and the disbelievers. In verse 3, in this third verse, John experienced Christ's victory come to a close in verses 5 through 8. In verse 5, God says, I'm making all things new. So he's not just refurbishing a few things and he's making an entirely new heaven, which was our point before. John is then directed to begin writing because God said, it is finished, it is done, in verse 6. In God's final comments in this vision about Christ and victory, he promises an eternal reward and a personal relationship for all who will come to him through Jesus Christ, the one who overcomes. In verse 7, we want to be like Christ. This is one of the most beautiful promises in the whole Bible. This is the ultimate fulfillment of God's covenant. It unites his children back to himself within his eternal presence, to dwell with his people as their God, and he will call us his own in heaven. But the unrepentant sinners, we are reminded in verse 8, will be banished into the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So this passage draws that clear line of distinction. God's people will inherit eternal life, joy, and intimacy with God, while the unrepentant will inherit eternal separation from God. And there's another dichotomy that's presented here. The spring of the water of life in verse 6, and the lake, both water, the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, verse 8, symbolize the two ultimate destinies for all of humanity. We want to go to the spring of the water of life. We don't want to wind up in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. Now, in the few moments that we have remaining, I want to tell you that we have just now concluded the third vision here in chapter 21 and verse 8, and we are getting ready to start the fourth vision. And just a reminder of where we have been. The first vision that we saw in the book of Revelation, I told you at the very beginning of class, this really provides for us a pretty good outline of the entire book of Revelation. The first vision, which I call Christ and the church, we saw Christ walking among the lampstands, and we saw 7 letters to 7 churches in Asia Minor. In the second vision, which I refer to as Christ in the world, we were given the opportunity to glimpse behind the veil of the heavenly realm. We got to see God's throne room and things that are going on in God's throne room, and particularly the one that was found worthy in order to open the seals on the scroll that was in God's hand, and it was a lamb that was slain. It was Christ. And we saw him open sequentially 7 separate seals that were revealing the judgment that God would be bringing against the wicked evildoers of the day. We also saw 7 trumpets being given to 7 angels, and they sounded these trumpets, and these became warnings for the evildoers that God's judgment is at hand. And then we saw 7 bowls of wrath being given to 7 angels, and they poured these out upon the earth, this was bringing about the judgment of God upon wicked evildoers during the day. And then the vision that we just concluded is this third vision. We saw the doom of Babylon, which we understand now is the fall of the city of Rome. We saw the wedding of the Lamb being identified for us. And then the battle of Armageddon, this great war that was waged between Christ and his forces against Satan and his allies and their forces. We saw Satan ultimately overthrown today in our class, and we also saw the judgment at the great white throne being described for us. This, of course, is the final judgment. Now, this fourth vision that we will get into next week is the final vision in the book of Revelation. This is God's final word for God's people. This represents the final message in the entire Bible. So it's very important for us to spend a little bit of time looking at this final vision. It completes God's word, and it leaves us with great hope and desire for an eternal home in heaven. This fourth vision, John will learn much more about the splendor and the beauty of heaven, and he will relay as much as he possibly can to us about New Jerusalem, which was introduced in verse 2 of chapter 21. John will now be shown that New Jerusalem is far superior to Great Babylon or Rome or any other city that man has ever made. We will see that revealed in this fourth and final vision. But unlike Rome, New Jerusalem will never see any disease, poverty, or destruction. And before we go any farther, I'm going to go ahead and mark that we're going to start right there next week. Next week, we will pick up this study in verse 9. And please be back for this next study. There's not a whole lot of additional content that I really need to share with you. But I want to present something next week that I've never read anywhere or seen presented anywhere. But the book of Revelation contains 7 Beatitudes. And I want to describe for you the meaning of these Beatitudes that are found in the book of Revelation. I think they definitely speak to our existence today, and they're sprinkled throughout the book. So be prepared for that. Go ahead and read the remainder of the book of Revelation. We will wrap things up next week. Again, thank you for your interest in this topic. I hope this has been beneficial to you to understand more about this final book in the New Testament and in the Bible. Thank you.